Hello again, everyone. I am Kimberly Carey, owner of So Sassy Stitcher, and I am working on my bench pillow from Stitch in Heaven out of Texas, the Riley Blake design. And so I started going through this, got my fabrics cut. I didn't see any changes in the instructions. I did everything the same. You can, if you want to, increase the size of some of your squares in order to have a little bit of extra on your stitch and flip if you want to. There's a lot of them though, so if you do that, be very careful that you're not oversizing them and you're getting them on precisely how you want on that rectangle, because it will make a difference when you put this one together. So just be aware of that. Comes with all of the main fabrics. It does not come with the backing fabric. And I'm a little bummed because when I signed up for this one, I thought it did, but that's my own fault for assuming. This is bee-utiful, cute little bee and a couple of flowers, which I actually really like this one. I think this is my favorite one look-wise so far. But again, there's nothing that I would do differently in the cutting instructions. Everything's actually written down correctly. So that's really good. Just make sure that you know which ones are which. There's 3 different green/tealy ones besides the main background fabric. So just make sure that you get those correct and get the right ones there. First thing that you're gonna do is you are going to work on the flower, and you can see I have a finished flower here. So this is what this guy looks like. My ironing instructions are a little bit different, so that seams will nest together and you can get these nice little points without having too much bulk there. The way these ironing instructions are, everything when you stitch and flip goes towards that triangle, that cut off corner, but we're gonna wanna re-iron a few of those to make those match up. So I'll talk about that in a minute, but on the flower, you're gonna put the little squares on the edge, stitch and flip, okay? So just using any sort of marking tool. Again, I like to use the friction pens to mark. They come off really great with heat. These are the fine liners, and they have a smoother tip than the pens do. They don't catch on the fabric. So you can use any sort of marking tool. I like to use something like this that's nice and small, especially if I'm going to be doing half square triangles, doing both. But these, it's just stitch and flip, so it doesn't really matter. So just corner to corner, marking that so that you have know exactly where you're going to stitch. Again, on these, when I make that mark, I'm going to stitch just a scant to the inside of that triangle, and that's going to allow that piece to come clear over and complete that rectangle, since I didn't oversize these. So I want to make sure that it accounts for that. Now, when you get these ironed on, I go ahead and, or sewn on, I'm going to go ahead and iron them open before I cut them off. And so the way that I like to do that is with my add a quarter ruler. And when you have ironed them over, this add a quarter, because it has this little lip, sits really nicely in that groove that was made because you ironed it open. And then I can cut that little tag off because we don't need it. We just need the seam allowance so that that sits nice and square on that yellow. And that's going to be the top of our flower, and then it gets rectangles attached to that. The bottom of our flower is going to be really important that we get the correct size squares in the correct places. So you're going to turn it lengthwise essentially and have the small squares at the bottom. Two, because you're making 2 flowers, are going to be just at the bottom, and then the others are going to have a bigger square on BK8 on the upper corner. You want to make sure that you have 2 and 2 so that they sit opposite, and that's going to make our flower. Again, we're going to do the stitch and flip method just like we did on the top of the flower, and then we're going to cut those corners off. Now, here's where one of my ironing changes are going to come up. On this middle guy, once we get these seam allowances cut, then we're going to take the iron and we're actually going to re-iron these seams to go back the other way. We want them to go inside so that they nestle nice and good with the pieces next to them. Because when we do the stitch and flip method, when they all go the same direction, then it's going to have a big old seam sitting right there. Whereas if we flip that, then that's going to allow those seams to nestle together. It's going to reduce the bulk that you have when you put these together. So when I lay this over, then my middle one is going to go that way, and my outer one is going to go towards the blue, towards that little triangle, and then you can see they nestle together nicely, and then that piece is going to get sewn together like that. You don't even really have to pin it because those seams just sit right together, kind of like a set of spoons. Okay, so we're going to do that. So that middle piece of the petal flower, you're going to swap the direction of your seams to go towards the red on those. And then they get little rectangles on the side of those when you finish putting those petals together. So you can see I made a note, just little arrows here to remind myself that those need to go the other direction so that we get nice little snuggle seams. Now the leaves are going to be kind of like the petals, that we want to make sure that we get the triangles in the right corner because we are making opposite leaves. And so you can see here I've got 2 of them. I've got big ones in the middle, medium ones on the outside corner, and then I will add the BK7s to the upper corner of these leaves, and they're going to overlap on this piece a little bit, which is going to be include our 1/4 inch seam allowance so that we get a nice little point to our flower there. But I'm just going to mark that corner to corner. And so when we finish it out, you can see that when this goes into our seam allowance is going to come right here, and it's going to give us a nice little point here at this leaf. So this will be the next step of our leaves. And then again, they get rectangles put on, making sure that you are paying attention to where those rectangles go so that the leaf is placed correctly on that flower. The flowers are pretty simple and basic. Nothing crazy with regards to the flowers. Then we're going to talk about the bee. The bee antennae are going to be a little bit of a challenge, only because you start with a square this same size, and then you're going to add these teal squares on top of it and cut off most of that blue square. And so the way the instructions read, actually, they don't even have ironing instructions. So for this one, because it's stitch and flip, you're gonna, originally, it's gonna go to the teal. Now, when you go to put these together, this right here, if you had them both to the teal, is gonna create a lot of bulk in this center, and you're not gonna get a good point right there. And when you go to quilt it, you're gonna have a lot of bulk that your needle has to go through, and it's gonna hang up potentially. So in order to combat that, what I did is on one of them, you can see I reversed the ironing so that that teal goes across to the blue. Now, because this piece is so skinny, so narrow, it's less than 1/4 of an inch. It's not going to accommodate both directions. So I just did one, and I only did it on one side, again, to get that nice snuggle seam when I put it together. So just on one side, you're gonna flip and re-iron that so that you can get this good point here, okay? It alleviates the bulk, and it allows you to get that nice crisp point for that antenna. I think that's probably the hardest part of the bee, and then it will go to the head. Now, you want a point here on this part. This point isn't going to matter as much because it's less than 1/4 inch. So it's going to end up being cut off just a little bit and be a flat spot. You're not going to have a point. If you try to make a point right there, that's not going to work real well for you. You're going to have a tiny little seam that's going to pull out. So that's not important. You're going to come up a little bit in your seam allowance. So just keep that in mind, that the only point that you really have to worry about getting right is this one right here. Then again, on the wings of the bee, you want to be sure that you are getting the placement right on all of these corners. And so what I do, honestly, is I take the piece and I match it up to the picture, and then I put my pieces on like so, and make sure that when I draw those corners, it's gonna go the right direction that I want it to go. And so you only have one wing of each direction. So I just lay that out and make sure that it's going the right direction. Now, you also want to make sure that before, if you have overlapping stitch and flip squares like this, you want to cut your seam allowance off on the first one before you add that second one. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to cut this one off where it needs to be, and you're going to end up with extra bulk there that you don't need. So cut that off before you stitch on those other squares. Now, then this is going to go together like so when I get that stitched on to become the bee body and wings. And then I have the bee body here. And so you can see it ended up being a flying geese. You have to do it the more traditional method, that is the stitch and flip. Again, just making sure that it is that scant seam on there when you are stitching along that line in order to get it to flip over and be the correct size. You can oversize this if you want to. I would oversize, I'd add 1/4 inch to each dimension of those if you want to do that, and then you can square that up to make sure that it's nice and pretty. But if you're doing that scant seam, then it shouldn't be too big of a deal for you. And making sure that when you add any of these squares to the rectangles for the stitch and flip, that you're allowing it to run nicely along there, and you're not pulling and distorting that along the bias, because you are stitching along the bias when you do that corner to corner. And if you stretch that, that is going to distort your piece and it's not going to lay flat for you. So what I do is I just make sure that it's on there nice and square, and then I put it under my machine and let it stitch without pulling and yanking on it. Especially for these little guys, I have it nice and lined up before I ever start stitching, so that I'm not having to readjust, because that's going to pull that bias out. Okay, with these guys, again, we're gonna change a little bit of the ironing instructions in order to get those seams to snuggle nicely for us. So on these wings, the dark blue, one of them is gonna need to go the other direction. Doesn't matter which one, but we wanna change that to get those snuggle seams so that when you put that together, it's gonna sit nicely. The nice thing about this is that most of these seams don't really matter which way they go, but I will say on the body, they have them going out to these just regular rectangles, which is probably fine. But if you want them to fit a little bit better, if I have this one going that direction, then I'm going to bring this one in that direction, and then vice versa. If this one goes towards the dark blue, I'm going to have this one go out towards the teal. And that's because they match up right here at this point. That's going to allow them to snuggle a little bit better than if they're going the same direction. Because they're at an angle, it's not going to matter as much if you don't do this, but this will make it slightly better. When we get to putting the bee next to the flower, you have these seams here that are going to match up at the base of the wing and at the bottom of the flower petal row. And so just make sure that when you are ironing those, I went away from the flower petals, and then I'm gonna go towards the wing when I iron those wings on. And that's gonna, again, allow those snuggle seams. It's gonna make sure that that point is correct and not off and wonky. And then that's gonna help your whole piece line up and not get off kilter like this, okay? So just be aware of that. I think that's the only ironing differences. Other than that, it really doesn't matter a whole ton how you iron these for this, because there's not a lot of matching seams, which is nice. Then the last piece of this pillow is the pieced border. And so it's going to be important that the inside piece with the flower and the bees are the correct size, so that your pieced border will fit. And then again, because there's so many of these little pieces, even being off a minute amount in your seam allowance, it's going to show, and it just gets amplified every single time. So this is a really good time to practice those scant 1/4 inch seams. Again, we want not quite a full 1/4 inch, because you're gonna add just a little bit when you fold it back. So you really wanna be a thread or 2 width, not much, to the right of that 1/4 inch, so that when you fold it over, then that is the perfect 1/4 inch. I followed the pattern on the picture for placement for all of those. I didn't want to try to figure out randomness because I've got other things to do. They randomized it for me. I'm just going to follow that. So that made it pretty easy. Still working on putting those together. You're going to want to put together top and bottoms first, and then do the sides, okay, to put those together. Again, here ironing, they didn't give ironing instructions, but again, you want to alternate those so that your seams will snuggle together. And so let me grab a couple here that I have that are opposite. This isn't the ones that are going to be put together, but if you look at these, you know, you don't see really any difference, but when I fold it over to put them together, you can see my seams are opposite. And so when I put them together, those seams just snuggle right in together. Now, because there's so many of these, I will pin these. I wouldn't necessarily have to, but I want them to fit nice. If I don't, what I do is I start my seam, I stitch to where I have them snuggled together. I leave my needle down and I stop, and then I get the next seams snuggled together. I hold that and I stitch to that point. So that if you don't like to pin, don't like to take the time to pin, then you can do it that way. And if you have those snuggle seams, it's gonna fit in quite nicely, actually. And then if you have any extra, if your seams weren't quite right, then you can work on easing those in as long as you're holding those snuggle seams together. I don't always like to pin because it can move your lining. When you line these up, it can alter that a little bit. So it's really a matter of what you are comfortable with. More experienced quilters tend not to pin as much because it slows them down, and they can get those seams to come out the way that they want them to if they've had a lot of practice with that. So I just made myself notes on my pattern as to which way I was going to iron them so that I could just have that next to me and I'm ironing them in the correct direction, because I just granny stitched them together, doing one pair after another, and kept them in order so that I wasn't fiddling around with them. Then I took those pairs and paired them up, and then I'll do the same thing again. Now, the way that they show is to do the two together, which is the way that I'm going to do it. So that you're going to put the two pieces together, and then I will stitch them onto the flowers and the bee. For the top and bottom, you could technically put one row on and then the other row. It's going to make it a little bit harder to snuggle those seams together just because you're going to be working with a big piece and a small piece, whereas if you put these two together, you're going to have two of the same size pieces, so it's going to work better for you. So that is correct. Again, the ironing directions, I'm not going to follow their directions. I'm going to follow what works for mine to get those snuggle seams so that it lays as flat as possible, so that when I go to quilt it, it's not an issue with seams that are too bulky because they went the same direction. Again, this pattern is relatively simple. There is a lot of stitch and flip, with the rectangles and the squares to get the flowers and the leaves and the wings of the bee. So there is a lot of stitch and flip. They really like that method of putting things together. But then you've got the 2.5-inch square border, which goes really fast and easy. So I hope this is helpful for you guys. Happy quilting, happy putting it together. I will show you the finished product when I get it quilted and put together. Life is gonna get a little bit crazy with my kids in the next couple months and family come in to visit and things like that, but I will do my best to get these done and put up in a reasonable amount of time. I really like this one, so I don't think it'll be too hard to get motivated to put it on the machine and get it done so that I can get it out and enjoy it. All right, happy quilting. I hope it works out for you, and leave me comments if you feel like it. Thank you so much for watching.